Hello and welcome to the Honest Not Perfect podcast. My name is Suzanne Ellingham and I'm the director of Source Events, the platform that helps connect retailers, brands and wholesalers to manufacturers and makers globally.
And my name is Jack Stratton. I'm director of Insider Trends. We are a global retail trend spotting agency helping brands to spot what's coming next.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Honest Not Perfect. My name's Susanna Ellingham and I'm the director of Source Events, that's Source Home and Gift and Source Fashion. And today I'm joined by Simon Platts, who amongst many different hats has spent a good 10 years at ASOS as their head of sourcing and buying. And today we're going to talk about some of his journey in retail, both before and during that, and also some of the work that he's doing at the moment in terms of circularity, end of life, and also supporting UK manufacturing, which is something I think we all feel fairly passionately about. So Simon, how did you get started in retail? And I think you're one of the few people who I come across who's had a full career in retail.
Yeah. So I started in 1985 when I was 16 as a Saturday boy in a shop in Sheffield. And that's how it got me into the retail industry. It wasn't necessarily a chosen path, if you like. I was a lot more sort of sporty and active, but Saturday job in Next back in the mid 80s was like, you were a rock star. And I worked through, and then as I finished sixth form, was offered a management training program, which I went on and took a full-time job in Next. And then decided that I thought, you know what, I've spent my time in the shops, I'd perhaps get back into the sports side of things. I was heading off to Camp America, actually, and I was just filling in forms for that. And while I'd been in the shops, I'd got heavily involved in visual merchandising. I always made sure my shop looked great, and actually the other shops in the region looked good. And the area managers, regional managers used to send me out and about and make sure that things looked good. I used to kind of work with the window dressers and take that into store. And, shops that look good sell more. It could, at that time, it could have been about moving products, or it could have just been literally how they were displayed and merchandised together, outfits and so on. Anyway, that got noticed, and I got invited down to head office in Leicester, lived in Sheffield, and they offered me a role to lead visual merchandising for men's and boys wear. So I did that for about 4 years, and then got I got asked to move out of visual merchandising into buying by a gentleman called Christos Angelides, who's at Reese now, but had many roles. He was leading buying, and he said, you should come and be a buyer. And I was like, well, that sounds good, because I hear that they get to fly around the world, and, sounds amazing.
Sounds a bit more glamorous.
It sounded very glamorous, but I didn't have a university degree. I'd kind of come through the stores, and actually that's what they were looking for, that balance and that flair, if you like, not just a degree
real
as
world,
such.
this is how the store works.
Yeah, exactly, and how fashion works and how customers behave and so on. So moved into buying. I bought most areas within menswear product categories at Next, and then moved and set up the UK arm of Next Sourcing, which was the international sourcing office based out in Hong Kong. We had many regions where we had satellite offices, and it was for me to try and ensure that I was working with the buying teams to generate as much business to go through that side of the sourcing arm, so it stayed, if you like, within the group rather than with independence. And obviously we had efficiencies and benefits within that. And then after just under 20 years, I thought, you know what, it's time to try something new, and I co-founded a supplier called Lazati UK. We manufactured, we started with men's swimwear, men's swim shorts, and we worked with most of the high street from M&S, Tesco's to Paul Smith and so on. But that led into other product categories because of the areas that I'd worked on, and the buyers I was working with knew my background, so they were, can you help with this? Do you know anyone that can do that? So we did lots of different categories, but not what you would see as the traditionally big ones like your denim and your jersey wear and your shirts. It was niche. Accessories, footwear, swimwear, hats, gloves, scarves, where actually the pie was smaller, but if you did a good job for the retailer, you could get a larger part of the pie. And I focused on product development as well as good manufacturing. So we'd now term as, ethical, responsible suppliers, and also looking at different materials that would perform better but would also be more sustainable. I was making swim shorts out of recycled polyester, albeit plastic, PET polyester, back in the day before kind of even became a thing because it needed to be something that we were looking at. So I worked in supply chain. Then I was approached by an ex-colleague of mine just after JD Sport Group had bought Blacks and Millets, and they'd taken that on. I don't think they particularly wanted to buy it, but I know that they were asked to get involved, and it's a good job they did actually, because they now own most of the outdoor world. They've got Go Outdoors and Tyzo. Obviously, Blacks and Millets are still trading, and I went in there as head of buying for brand and own brand. So it was to help redevelop the Peter Storm brand, and they were looking at a more adventurous, a slightly more what we'd call up the hill product, performance product, not just something you'd wear walking around the Cotswolds sort of thing. So it was developing own brand, but also bringing in and
some of that expertise.
Yeah. So from that branded buying, own brand buying, but also then looking at some of the bigger brands that we could bring in to attract customers. So not just like North Face and Berghaus, but some of the other big outdoor brands like Haglofs, Bergens, Montaigne, Mammut, really look at how we could get the customer. And they'd gone through a tough time, so it was rebuilding that outdoor world.
I was going to say, it sounds like where you started was with something that was pretty uninspiring, with the best one, probably the wrong word to use. But actually the role was, how do we bring on board the right brand mix to make this as relevant as it possibly is right now, whilst also balancing that own label, private label quality that can give the profitability that they need.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, generally speaking, the own brand tends to be the jewel in the crown of any retailer. Yeah. Like at ASOS brand was just under 50% of the turnover, but was the area you could make considerable profit. Compared to what you'd be working through a third-party brand. And I think, people sometimes say, well, and why do you care? Why did you then get into what you got into? Because I eventually moved out of Blacks and Millets, which was, for me, a bit of a busman's holiday, because that outdoor active sport, it was
fun.
I was head of buying for outdoor brands, own brand and brands. And, I mean, that a job? I was like, I'd pay to do it. I was absolutely loving it. But I was approached by another colleague of mine, a lady called Kate Bostock, who'd been at M&S for a long time. I'd worked with her Next, to go and work for this clothing brand ASOS. Now, I'd heard of ASOS, but, being the brand that it is, very focused on 20-something, and me being 50-something, it probably wasn't the best match. But I did know it. I did ask her at the time, is that the cycling brand or the... No, I knew it was the clothing brand.
It was good to check, though.
It was good to check, yeah, because, trying to work for a brand that sells £300 cycling shorts versus, a faster fashion brand, a very different gig. And I remember talking to Kate about the role, which was sourcing director. I eventually termed it responsible sourcing director, because I wanted to ensure that the social and environmental sides were captured with the sourcing. So when we went out to look for factories or look for regions, as any sourcing person should do, you were considering all the other bits that needed to come into play, and not just looking for the cheapest needle on the planet.
Quick question on that one, because it's interesting that you went for the title of responsible sourcing as opposed to sustainable, which I think is a term that's been... Why was it important for you to choose that particular word as opposed to sort of have this conversation with everyone, because it fascinates me?
Well, for me, at the time, we had an ethical trade team, small team, and we had a sustainability team. And at ASOS at that time, the sustainability team were focused on materials and sustainability in that space, not a sustainable business model as such, but sustainability of the materials it use, better cottons and so on and so forth. And then the ethical trade team was the social side, which is now ESG, environmental social. And I didn't want to take the word sustainable, because it for me only picked one part.
It was so narrow in its view.
It meant materials, so you couldn't really say it's the sustainable and ethical sourcing. So I just came up and said, well, just call it responsible. I mean, I know that term, not because I used it, but just it's been more accepted.
We use it quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I think from my view, the reason we use it quite a lot in the shows is I feel that responsible just means that you're trying to make the right decisions for the right reasons.
Yes, yeah. You could argue, and I would argue now, knowing what I know 10 years on, I was at ASOS for 10 years, you need to caveat, really. You don't do it because it sounds rubbish, but you should really caveat everything. Say, this is sustainable, this is ethical, this is responsible, with the word more. Genuinely, to be truthful, nothing is perfect. We talk about this
Honest
podcast.
Not
Honest Not Perfect. Within the business I'm working, one of the businesses I'm working with now, within Recon, we talk about progress, not perfection. So it's about how we could be more responsible than we've been, and that would be by looking and making sure the business had a strategy around where it's sourced, why it's sourced, knowing what might be the dangers in that region, or the dangers of those fabrics. Where are the better ones? How do we commercialise that? Because the whole thing is being pushed into a commercial model with shareholders and investors. So unless you're being philanthropic, or even Patagonia would argue that, they're not perfect. They still
They come straight out and say it.
You can't, and they come straight out and say it, although I was a bit worried about their campaign around "do not buy this jacket," and then finding out that it was the best-selling jacket they'd done. But they certainly didn't intend to do that. And you know what? Most brands are a long way off that before they can even start playing in that area of how responsible they are. So hats off to Patagonia and brands that operate in that space. We've got some in the UK. People like Alpkit, based in the Midlands and very much around the Peak District, kind of outdoor, a bit like that side of Patagonia. Finisterre, born out of Cornwall and now growing around the UK. And I'm always in awe of what those guys are doing. Absolutely love what Finisterre are doing. Tom, the founder, is just phenomenal, and they've got a wonderful team. And they're really trying to push the boundaries and deal with the challenges, but also run a commercial business. And I think what's really important is people understand that association between purpose and profit, and they don't have to be dragged apart. It's kind of throughout my career, certainly from becoming a buyer and then moving through, I always wanted to know where my products were coming from, why they were costing what they costed. So I understood, they need to be paid. Okay, well, let's have a conversation about how we could do that more efficiently, and therefore could we drive an advantage for you, an advantage for me to get the best intake margin and the best price I can get, but not by, let's make it with that fabric instead. Let's not use as much. Let's take a seam out. Let's find a factory that's not so caring.
Or alternatively, we'll buy more units.
Or we'll buy volume to chase intake margin, which is as we all should know, is a complete false economy, because you're just marking, people are still knowingly buying 40% markdowns in out there today to get a certain price. And it's, for me, it really is about achieving the most real and practical intake margin, but then holding on to that to get your profit, your exit, your net.
And I think that's one of the things when we talk to people, because we work with a lot of great retailers, a lot of big brands, a lot of big wholesalers, but we also work with small and mid-sized retailers and brands as well who haven't had people within their business with the experience of someone like you or some of the other people that we work with. And often they're targeted on intake margin, and that's the only metric that they have. So we call that a false economy. Yeah. Could you maybe talk a little bit about why that's a false economy?
Well, it's going to drive an action, and that action will have a consequence. You will inevitably, if you are being KPI'd on a number that's either unrealistic or, you're being challenged for better margins, I think the race to the bottom has begun in this space, and for lots and lots of reasons which we may get around to, but ultimately people are being challenged for better prices. Now, you could look at anything, food, bread, milk, how much things have gone up over the last 20, 30 years. Yet I know my outfit that I bought in 1985 as a Saturday boy, which was a size small shirt, a 28 regular trouser, a pair of American brogues. The shirt was probably 22, the trousers were probably 40. The brogues would have been about 50, 60 quid. I'm now 36 long, extra large shirt. That's 2 sizes bigger shoe size. But the shirt's probably cheaper. The shoes are probably, how's that work? It's like, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And yes, there has been massive advances in technology for manufacturing. There are efficiencies, there is suppliers, there's planning, there's commitments, there's all sorts of things that still can achieve you efficiency, which gives you a really lean price. And then on top of that, it's how much are you buying, how much do you need, how much you think you're going to mark down, how much, so there you get your balance of far, near and onshoring. And I think that's the biggest opportunity for brands today. But that opportunity, because it probably means that some of the intakes will be hit because you're moving closer and being more relevant, there's a nervousness. But the truth is, yes, your intakes might be hit, but just make sure they're solid for the region you're in. But what you're going to capture is speed, relevance for consumer, quality, less risk to your brand because of who you're working with and how you're planning, and therefore your net and your profit will be much better. But it's a bit of a leap of faith. But it's not also.
I don't think it's a
real.
leap of faith.
It's
I
real.
feel like it's.
It's seen like that though by a lot of.
I think it's looking at the whole product life cycle, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Surely it's not just looking at what your intake is. It's actually looking at the whole product life cycle of, okay, we can buy it in this, but we're realistically only going to sell. If it's really good, it'll sell 70% of it.
Yeah.
And then the rest of that 30 is either going to go onto sale or it's going to be warehouse, and it's just cash that's sat in a warehouse. But by the way, we have to pay for the warehouse and logistics to get it there as well. Mm-hmm. And actually, when you look at the entire cost of that, then it's not so much of a leap of faith. Well, that's, and I was being generous with the 70%.
Yeah, 70% is very generous. But that's for me where a lot of the problems lie. The way that I was brought up as a buyer, as a trainee and as assistant, and the way that I was schooled in that way of there was an element of me as a person, because as a kid I cared about outdoor. That was my world, nature. I used to be the one, if a kid stood on a snail, I'd be like, why did you do that? Rather than, let's squash snails, So it was always in me. But then I was brought up, if you like, with Next and went through. We had a thing called buying school. But it gave me a real good education, bolted into my personal standards and beliefs, bolted into a want to do better and understand that actually by doing better doesn't mean you're going to be less profitable. Before you even look at for profit for people and planet, this is commercial profitability, which still has to be in this capitalist world and so on, has to be the thing that you achieve. So for me, it was always something that, and other people that I know that have come through in the past that have had that background. Whereas today, it's quite easy to be in charge of buying product when you're quite inexperienced. I'm not saying you don't know anything, but perhaps you've been, with the volumes, number of options, you've got to split that work. People get opportunities, and maybe if you've not invested as much in make sure they understand how to do what they need to do, then bad decisions can be made, and chasing an intake margin, and that we've seen lots of TV programs where it's shown buyers going, oh yeah, I got an extra 50p off and and you can do that, and you can do it with your eyes shut. But I'll tell you, the action, the consequences of that action will lead to the things that we hear about around, exploitation, modern slavery, abuse within the supply chain. And then we get onto planet in terms of materials, poor chemicals, and so on and so forth. We look at our industry as a fashion industry. It's about product. It's about things that make you feel good and allow you to be confident and give your best self. Yet sometimes when we talk about what goes on in that industry, anyone would think we were dealing in drugs or something. It's like, what slaves? Abuse, women, non-payments. What is this? This is supposed to be about an industry that is aspirational, and so it's got a long way to go. But for me now, there are brands, there are people, there is an awareness of what needs to happen there, and then belt and braces. You're bringing in what governments are now doing. It's almost like, look, you guys, you've had a long time to tidy your bedroom up and it's still a mess. Well, if it's not tidy by the time you come home from school next week, it's all going in the bin. And this is taxes, legislations, laws. And generally speaking, when we get to taxes and legislations and laws, they're not always the most balanced when they're just pushed through quickly, because they're trying to solve a problem and
trying to solve the problem that they think
is the problem, not really what might be the longer problem, and therefore they don't always work and can have another knock-on effect and so on. So that's a difficult one. But I do think we're at a point within industry now where we do need intervention in that space to drive brands. And I think one of the things I've been talking with various people that are, whether it be with government or the brands that are influencing, is also looking at opportunities to incentivise better behaviour. And that could be working closer to market, building out the UK, which we'll get onto no doubt. What would that look like? And how would we incentivise that? Because categorically, the price is going to be very different, and there's lots of things to valorize if you're a CFO or anybody working in that sort of finance side of things as to why. Why is it going to be better for me to pay a higher price for something, and how am I still going to make profit or even more profit? It doesn't make sense, but it does.
It comes back to one of those questions, and we were talking about this earlier, and it was there's competing priorities. You know, retail's tough, but people have still got to make a profit. They've still got to survive. But they also have people within those businesses who want to move them forward. And the reality is that good, well-made products does cost more. And you know that when you're buying it through. I think the question is how, not necessarily how do you manage those competing priorities, but is it a communication issue internally? Do these buyers who are trying to make these differences, are they able to communicate, actually, my KPI on intake margin and just being remunerated or targeted on that is maybe not the thing that we should be looking at? Do you think it's a conversation internally and how those CFO and those board level, how they understand the impact of actions and how it may not be a problem today, but actually, if we look at a total life cycle cost of product, that's one thing. Secondly, it's reducing the impact of legislation and changes that are coming through, trying to get ahead of the game, trying to future-proof your business. Do you think there's enough of that conversation happening?
I think there's more, and there's certainly not been enough. I mean, it's been put people in a position, get them doing the job, sort of thing, and that has played a part in why we're in the position we're in. I think CFOs, CEOs are now starting to realise, whether it be investors, whether it be through consumers' behaviour, although not everybody's walking the walk of what they say. Maybe Greta is probably the only one.
Well, I think we talk about younger consumers and what they say and what they buy, and I feel like it's consumers in general, not just younger
it's not
consumers.
just I mean, you could say, there's older ones that behave and the younger ones don't, and you could argue it both way around. It's just a generalisation that actually there is a consumer behaviour which is certainly driving an action, that need, that want for speed, convenience, cheap, led by the fact that the consumer hasn't got the same income disposable that it had. So it's having to, it would argue, well, I want to look good, but I can only afford to shop here, or here. Now, if here, or here is using unethical and poor sustainability practices, what we're saying that's your option then. That you can buy from products from brands that sell products that to get the price that so you can afford. They've had to use slaves, or they've had to use harmful chemicals, or they've had to use cotton, which is not more sustainable. Not one of the more sustainable options. So that's for you. That's not right. No. So I mean, there's a whole thing around that, like I say, around the consumer part, but. The opportunities now, I think that the real opportunities for brands now is for CEOs and boards to understand what's coming, to empower their teams that work in that ESG space and give them the support they need. It's not always financial, it's just give them a hearing, let them do the work, let them come back and present to you what's coming down the road. Don't look at the ESG team as the guys that are a mile down the road, round the corner, putting rocks in your path. They're the ones down there finding the rocks and trying to find ways to move them so that by the time you get there are no rocks and you can just plough on through.
I think there's a lot of ESG people who would thank you for that description.
Yeah. I mean, listen, that whole thing around ESG or people that have worked in sustainability, the fatigue, the psychological, there is a I can't remember what the term is now, but there is a thing around burnout in that space and around psychological impact of working in a team like that sees these things, that's trying to change them within businesses, and then sees that the businesses aren't really giving them the attention or the input that's needed. And how does that make you feel? You can't unsee what you've seen, and then it can start to, that's psychological.
Well, I think I've seen this in the people that we work with, because we do speak to a lot of people in the sustainability space. And I think we mentioned somebody earlier that had gone to a fairly big retailer that had lasted 3 months. And I think the challenge is that when we've got a whole group of very talented, very principled people who want to do things better, who want to make an impact, who want to make a change, and then go into these businesses and all of a sudden realise that it's profit that matters. Yeah. And it's how do we retain those people? Because all that will happen is probably one of two things. A, they'll leave, or B, they'll just do it the way it's always been done because that's what the company wants.
Well, what you just said there, these people will bring you profit. I know that a buyer can go and chase an intake or can do things and get a good price, and you think that will deliver you profit, and it may do. But imagine the people that also need to contribute. You were saying earlier about, if they just KPI'd on that one thing, that's what they do. What we need now is an ability to be able to make a purchase on a product that plays to absolutely everything it needs to play to. And then you can understand what your exit or your net margin is, and that's where your profitability is.
I'm sure most people listening will understand we're talking about the impact of very large Chinese retailers coming into the UK. And one of the things that they do incredibly well that is really disruptive is their use of advanced technologies like AI to be able to target so accurately what will sell, by how much, and in what region. So they manufacture just enough.
Which is the model. Always should have been and always was the model. The ideal model is design it, sell it, then make it.
Yeah,
nobody really, no brand set up to think, well, we'll buy a load of stuff knowing we'll mark half of it. That's not the model. It just became the model. And then what we've done, if you like, with faster fashion and with e-commerce and that ability, it became not so much about speed, but the breadth, because you didn't have a physical space that you could only display so many items.
I think we talk about buying is not a problem. People will buy.
There is that circle, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's, you can now give your electrics back. Consumption is not the enemy, provided it's done in a responsible way. Problem is, at the moment, it's done without any thought for what that consequence might be. But if we just part consumption, if we use the models that are available, so actually doing fashion fast and relevant, not fast fashion as we've termed it, but doing
just
fashion fast or relevant fashion to the right, and getting it so that you use your sourcing know-how for near, far, and onshore. Then, the balance, never more has it been right to look at that different balance within that space and not just go after the cheapest needle. And if we were using that smart way of buying today, and if brands were to invest in their buyers and their product developers and give them the tools that enabled them to make the right purchase decision for when they knew that product needed to be where it needed to be and how much they needed without the markdown, with the profitability, then they would do that. It's just that's not alive today in the form it needs to be. There's a massive opportunity for that to be a thing. Like you say, there's quite a few of these Chinese brands that are doing a version of that, and it's obviously with the consumer. It's offering them a product at a price, at a level of speed, that they are lapping up.
The reality is you just said level of speed, but we're still talking a good 4-5 weeks.
4, 5, 6 weeks.
And consumers will wait that long.
That's interesting, because we're seeing this new model now, not necessarily in clothing, but certainly in other products. It does seem that consumers will wait a little bit longer. Most people, it was next day delivery. And I know still that's become that has become a thing, whether it's food, shopping, pizzas, supermarkets, whatever. That has been, even lingerie delivered by your delivery guys, and other product categories. That has become something that's not just novelty. It's now become part of our lives. You could be like cooking dinner or preparing to cook dinner at lunchtime and think, well, I'm missing some ingredients. You can go online and they'll deliver it to you. We've got used to that convenience. We become maybe a bit lazy, a little bit less organised, and a bit less aware of what the impact of that is. Now, you could argue, well, if I had to go out and drive and fetch them, there's a carbon footprint. If someone's delivering them to me and they're doing some other stuff and it's done in the right way, that's a lower. Okay, so there'll be arguments all the way around for some of this stuff. But generally, a lot of these convenience and activities are done without a thought for what that is actually leaving in terms of legacy. Yeah. And certainly in clothing, the legacy of cheap clothing, poor quality, disposable, is well, we know it's a thing, and it's not something that's going to be tolerated, whether that's going to be decided on by governments and lawmakers. But I think and I hope that consumers will start to behave differently as well.
I think what's interesting that we talk about is that, and we had a conversation about this a few days ago, is people are very focused on the price of that particular item and driving the lowest possible price on that garment, but they forget all of the other little add-ons that come into that price.
Transport,
sampling,
duties, taxes, sampling,
packaging,
if you're
taxes.
Is it if you're saying, well, we can't get a cheaper price, so we're knocking that onto the consumer. And I would argue, before you even talk to a consumer about putting a price up, can you honestly say you are using all the technologies that mean you don't need to sample, you don't need to do, back in the day.
Who are you using on packaging?
Packaging. Are you recovering packaging? Are you using that to offset your levies and your taxes? If you've not got all them things in place, then you are being irresponsible. You're also being not commercial. So you're harming people and planet, and you're harming your bottom line. So for me, CFOs, there are ways to cut costs. There are ways to streamline your business. But not that I am a CFO, but if I ever could really talk to CFOs, maybe this is something I should do more of. I would be saying to them, do you realise that this area is really quite low-hanging fruit for you? But you need to understand and invest in it. And that means in the team you've got doing it, but then invest in how that flows into your business.
And also just invest more in buying technology.
Well, that's it. That then goes throughout the business. It then goes into the KPIs of the various different departments, as well as the board and the investors. And you start to see how things can be more responsible, but actually generate more profit. There's other arguments around categories that don't return profit, and you're all about growth. If you were smaller and more profitable, that would be better for the bottom line. But most industries and most businesses are about growth. Again, another conversation, another topic. But within this world, within this space, and within this industry, there is a lot of opportunity to be better for people and planet and more profitable to the bottom line of the business. But it does need a bit of a breath and a bit of a moment, and from a CFO and from that sort of senior leadership team to say, yeah, we want to be here in the future. I know these things aren't here today. They're 2 or 3 years away, some of these taxes and levies and so on. But actually, we want to make sure we're ready for them, because a couple of years in the fashion industry is like a season. It's like you start talking about spring, summer 26 now, let alone, So actually, you do need to be quite ahead of the game in this space. And I think that's where the smart people will be. We're no doubt going to see people fall off the charts. It is difficult.
We've been seeing that anyway.
Well, we have, and it's...
And when we look, I think when we look at it generally, if we looked back, if we both had our crystal ball moment and went back 5 years, and obviously not putting COVID into that one, assume that was like glossed over. Could you predict the retailers that would still be here and the ones that wouldn't? I
think if we talk about 5 years, then I could see, what was coming in the way of where some of these Chinese, we were seeing some of these big Chinese companies, not necessarily in fashion, but in other categories. I was going to shows and exhibitions and sourcing events and seeing and hearing these names that have now become very familiar. So it was like, ooh, they're different. They're quite different. A bit like e-commerce was different to bricks and mortar. So the ones that have gone, sad though they are, doesn't surprise me. And the ones that have gone more recently and the ones that I think will go won't surprise me either, because they've lost sight of where their customers have gone. They've lost sight of how to be more profitable, or they've decided that, and I understand this, and this is what's really frustrating, because of what's happening in that product that's brought in and done in such a cheap way, it's forcing the ones that still exist to have to compete with that. And the quickest and easiest way to stay alive is to just go and chase, the smarter is to
race to the bottom on price, whereas the smarter way would be
let's work out how we do this and how we do this, thinking we've got a future. But, if you're up to below your nose in water and are you going to take that time and breath, or are you just going to fight?
Yeah.
And so that's a natural. I don't empathise, but I understand why some of the businesses are in the position they are and fighting for that survival. But I do think it's
so much of it is market conditions. So much of it is technology moving faster than anyone can keep up with.
Yeah.
But another side of it is maybe a lack of external feedback coming into that business to say, you know what, maybe we need to be looking ahead in a different way. Because if you think about retail 5 years, 10 years, I don't know if there's another industry that's moved quite so fast in terms of the way consumers react towards it and the opportunities and the shift in business models. And I think it's a difficult industry to thrive in at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think some of that comes through always maybe not challenging the assumptions that you've always held, like the one around how quickly a consumer wants a product. There's a fantastic brand called Unfolded. I love Callie and what he's done there. He's built an entire fashion business that's actually scaling fairly well around the principle of people will wait 6 weeks if they know it's being made really well, it's coming from a factory in India, they're transparent over how long things take. They've built an entire business around it. Yeah. So consumers will wait if they understand more about the product and the process.
It's that information that gives them the ability to make that choice.
So my question is, obviously you were within big retail for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. Was there a moment, or where was your I need to do something different moment? What made you leave that world and do what you're doing now?
Well, I guess it was from a personal point of view. I was 10 years with ASOS, and we really did drive, and they still are driving some phenomenal changes and are working smart, as I understand. They could be smarter, in my opinion, but they're working smart in terms of proximity. They're still leading on a lot of the social and environmental areas. So I'm proud of the work we did, the team, the leadership team. Some of the people are still there and are still pushing for this. But I just felt that I'd really had seen, I'd been part of the Global Fashion Agenda Steerco. I was part of ACT, which was another industry collaboration. I'd been working with Better Cotton, various different bodies, and I'd seen so much. And I just thought, you know what? I think maybe at my age and at this time, I could deliver, I could support, and I was very keen on the whole circularity part of things for both social, because again, this people and planet, we need to stop separating and we need to pull it together. It's one thing. If you don't change the way you behave with people, you'll not influence planet, and vice versa. And I just felt, you know what, I think it's time for me to look at if I could offer more to the industry by being out there in a consultative space. An opportunity arose to co-found a startup that's working specifically on circularity. But then there are other opportunities that I've been looking at, and hopefully in the new year we'll be looking to potentially generate some income, because I still have bills to pay, so I can't do this as if I've retired and I'm just helping, although I'm happy to do that. But through my consultancy, which is SP&KO, with a partner, Kathy, we hope to be able to offer brands, better knowledge on sourcing and ESG, a bit more insight, giving them that ability to understand profitability, and help the teams be able to go and educate their senior leadership so that these pennies drop. And I think that's an area that I understand, and an area where I can offer value to brands and other people outside. So I've been working very closely with a few people around issues that are relevant to modern slavery, which again, the very fact that we have.
We're still talking about that.
Just, I mean, gosh, it's just unbelievable. So there are just things that I really care about, and there's things that I know I can offer value. And then, as I say, I co-founded a business called Recom, which is initially a tech platform to work with brands to understand how they can engage with their consumers and recover products. Valorize that, whether that be in data or returning sales, drive into new product categories. But then what do we do with this stuff we get back? Well, there's a massive amount of value in that stuff, whether that's, look at repair, let's look at resale. You go through the hierarchy, you should keep things alive as long as possible, upcycle, downcycle, and eventually recycle. We should be sending nothing to landfill or to incineration. That's the truth of it. The problem is that a lot of the products that are still being developed today in the fashion space, not so much function, because you could argue, well, hang on a minute, Patagonia make nylon and polyester, but they're functional items. They'll be around. The real reason they're built to last and be repaired and so on. If you're making certain categories, dresses, whatever, and you're using you're generally using it for price. And it's a cheap option, and it's not. I don't mean sustainable. It's not sustainable commercially. It's not sustainable certainly from a planetary point of view. And even using recycled plastics, that's not sustainable. Fibre to fibre, yes, you've got some element of circularity, but the scale's not there yet on most fibre to fibre technology. You've got plenty of brands looking to get rid of stuff that can you take it and can you recycle it? But when it is recycled and it comes back into the market as a new yarn to be blended to make a new item, it's a little bit more expensive than the conventional alternative, and that's where they stop. And then, we're kind of like, oh, there's a hole in my bucket. You know, we're going round and round, and we're just not getting anywhere. So there's a lot to change in that space, but there's innovation coming, and technology that supports fibre separations and the quality of recycling, the better materials out the other side so they can be used. Yeah. You don't want to put a recycled material together and have a compromised quality product. So, you know, I know a few years ago when we were looking at denim, the percentage of recycled was quite small, 10, 12%. Now it's up to 20, 30% because technology is advanced and you can get still a performance, as in it's not going to fall apart by using recycled content. So it's moving, but we do need brands to think about the compositions of the product, because I spoke to many brands and they've said, well, what can we do with this? What can we do with that? And then I've said, well, this material here, there is no commercial, even in a lab, there's no real way of recycling that. So that will go to incineration landfill. Oh, we can't do that. Well, then stop making it.
Do you think there's a lack of awareness around materials?
I don't actually think there's a lack of awareness anymore. Okay. I think there's a price issue. And again, that then goes back to the whole story of, well, how could we do better materials? How could we move from regular cotton to organic or in conversion or BCI when it's some of it, not all of it, is a bit more expensive than the way we've bought it? Well, you've got to unlock some capital. Most companies are not in a place where they can just go, yeah, go on, let's just upgrade everything and I'll suck it up. It's not going to happen. Be able to balance and that, it's not right, but it's not wrong. It's commercial. It's just what it is. So how could you? When I looked at my sourcing team, we were looking at how could we move the way we sourced cotton or the product categories, materials, so that we could generate the upgrade in the material and without a financial negative impact, in some cases a financial positive impact that would allow me to upgrade and add more to the bottom line. It can be achieved, but it needs a team, it needs some understanding, and it then needs a commitment from the commercial side to purchase that product.
It needs commitment right the way through.
Correct, yeah.
Obviously, now you've got a little bit more spare time. I wouldn't say spare time, but time to work on what you're passionate about.
Yeah.
What's been the most exciting thing that you've seen, or the thing that you've just thought, oh my God, I've got to get involved with that? Has there been something since because you speak to a lot of very bright, intelligent, motivated, interesting people.
Yeah. And they're like, what am I speaking to him for?
Simon.
Numbnuts from Sheffield.
No. But what's been the most inspiring or interesting thing that you've had the chance to look at in the last year that's excited you?
Well, there's been a few, to be honest. I mean, honestly, when I first met Tom and started looking at Recom, the reason I got involved was because I thought, you know what, there's so many individual things going on. Working with something that will go out to customers and allow a seamless way of working and recovering products, seamless. Like it's seamless when you sell it, it's seamless when you do a return. Well, let's follow that model and work with consumers to bring products back. But then seeing the opportunities about where things could then go for repair, resale, recycle, upcycle, downcycle, I knew that I was bringing something to market that kind of captured the whole thing. We call it a one-stop shop. Yeah. It takes a bit of work and it needs to be almost tailored to each brand that wants to work with us, but it actually delivers the whole thing rather than, well, I'll deal with that person for rental, I'll deal with that person for that. And most of these dealing with individuals needs lots of people. Well, most teams work in ESG don't have a lot of people. 1 or 2, 5, 10, it's very small teams and they don't have time. It's difficult to manage. So giving them an area where, look, you come to me, we give you the solutions and then we point it to the network we've built, if you like. Yeah. It's like
I think it comes down to that. We've had this conversation a few times. It's like, how do we bring more manufacturing back into the UK? I think we've even got a debate on it scheduled in at the show because it's such a contentious issue, but it shouldn't be.
No, it should be part of your strategy. Far, near, onshore.
And I think if you understand where your margins are in each one of those places and you have trusted partners, some people are suppliers, some people are partners, that you can work with, it's how is that not ultimately part of your de-risking strategy across your supply base?
Literally. I'd ask exactly the same question. That's absolutely the question to ask. Why is that? why are you not considering? I mean, if you don't need, you could argue I don't need speed. I'm happy marking stuff down because I pay so cheap for it. Even with markdown, it's cheaper than buying it out of the UK. Oh, I can air freight it in. Well, that's not going to last very long because air freight it's never been a commercial thing. It's been a get out of jail card. Certainly to plan air freight is commercially wrong and certainly environmentally wrong. But yes, it is. But yet again, it's done because it's still cheaper than certain regions. But that still leaves you with that conundrum of markdown, holding stock. Again, it goes back to sort of a buyer being empowered to know fully what they're responsible for. And it's not just about achieving a certain thing as part of a process, a margin. It's, if you were to say to a buyer, right, you've now got to consider how long it will sit in a warehouse and we're going to charge you a daily rate on a per item per warehouse because we've got to pay for that warehouse. And you suddenly start adding all these things in.
And then you add how long it sits in that warehouse.
And maybe to the point where it's like, well, that's it. It's not ever going anywhere. And we're probably going to get at best $1 an item. Well, actually, would it be better to not take the $1, to get that product somewhere where it'll either get another shot at life or could go into to be recycled so that it might cost, you might have to spend a bit more to then get the value out of it the other side. Or again, you take the $1. But again, law, legislations, the idea that you can just job off or you can just send to charities, no disrespect to charities, but
I think most charities are fairly open around how much they get donated, how much they sell and how much they can use.
Yeah, and then what they do with, but the issue is then what they don't sell, what do they do with that? Where does it go and what kind of problems is that creating? I don't think it's relevant for a brand today to think, well, I give it to a charity shop or to a charity company and that's it, my hands are washed of it. EPR, end producer responsibility, will have you over their knee for that.
They'll be interested.
They'll be very interested because it's not enough. And again, you can't.
It's also taking responsibility.
It is.
You can't unsee.
You can't unsee. If you're doing that and then you're walking away, you're not taking any action, any kind of. You're not taking any of the consequence of where that might end up. Well, you will be. So understand, and actually, not only will you valorise that part because you'll need to know as part of your reporting, you'll not want it to go. You might even say to the charity, "We'll take it when you've tried, and then we'll put it through recycling, rather than letting you just send it off in bundles to wherever it goes around the world." Because actually, that material now, even though you've tried, is now valuable to us because we want to get that into our circle and start closing the loop. Because I mean, circling rubbish is not good. And having a circle that just pings out every time you get a material, and that's the biggest barrier at the minute. And we've seen great innovation, like RenewCell, massive innovation company in Sweden, that brands were happy to pile into to give them materials, but then weren't prepared to take the recycled materials and get, not because they weren't good quality or wouldn't perform, or
just slightly more expensive.
They were just a little bit more expensive. And actually right now we need cheaper. So how do you unlock that ability to invest in that? Well, then do something within your supply chain, or don't. And if you don't, I do think that the tide is coming in and it's going to catch you.
So this is a bit of a big question, but I'm going to ask it because I'm curious where your mind goes first. How do we encourage people back into UK manufacturing?
For me, it's about making it a safe space. There's been so much negativity. It's a hot topic. It's in the doorstep, therefore it's an easy journalist target. I wouldn't say it's been sensationalised because it's horrendous, some of the things that have been going on around UK manufacturing, but it has other places in the country as well. But it's just.
I was thinking there's in every country, so I say this quite a lot, not everything made in the Far East is awful.
No.
But not everything made in the UK is fantastic.
Correct.
And there's negative, there's plus and minus points in all of these countries. The question is, are you comfortable with the level of risk that you're doing enough to work with the right people? And if you will jump through the hoops to work with fantastic factories in India, in China, in Africa, and you do your levels of due diligence, why wouldn't you just apply that into UK?
Short term, probably because we don't need that much of it, and it's very expensive compared to. It's not expensive, it's the price it should be if it's done properly. But I think you then bolt on the fact that there's a nervousness about what's gone on and that could happen to us or we could be associated with it and so on and so forth. I'm actually looking at a bit of work now that is trying to understand if we were to rebuild what UK proposition could look like, full circle. So manufacturing, recovering, recycling capabilities, new materials. You wouldn't rebuild what we had in the past. You wouldn't be building mills that like cotton.
For purpose for the future.
It would technology. It would be working with other partners, but bringing something back to the UK, which included manufacturing, and done in a way that we could ensure, to the best of the abilities, that the brands could sleep at night in terms of ethical values, but would be aware of all the other things it brings to them in terms of speed, recycle materials, ability to really activate circularity, grow intake margin, more relevant to the customers, drive down, if you like, that overproduction side of things, and make consumption a more circular, responsible model. Why wouldn't you want to do that? And what would be the things that is blatantly stopping you from wanting to do that? Beyond price, I'll certainly be talking to brands saying, you will say two things to me straight away. We're worried about the factories and it's too expensive. Too expensive against what? What's your parameters to decide it's too expensive? Because if you want me to explain it to you, I can show you it's very profitable. And I know through doing what I did, it was very profitable and is a very profitable model. Even it's obviously profitable if you're not doing it ethically right, but it certainly can be profitable if you're doing it properly as well, and speed and all the other considerations. So,
do you think that would surprise people?
I think it would, because there's been, like I say, it's quite sensationalist and it keeps coming up about wages and abuse and so on, and abuse of poor wages and around the UK. It then gets targeted to specific regions. And I know categorically, I had to go and look. It took a bit of time. I had to go and look at the supply base. I had to go and think about who I did trust, who I wanted to work with, how we would work with them so that it was efficient and not, well, you're going to have to pay that because you're just in and out ad hoc. Well, no, actually, I'm going to plan and work with you, and I'm going to commit. And therefore, we'll work on a model that works.
It's a partnership, not a supplier.
Exactly. Now we're going to use technology. So we're going to look at how we print things so that we're only going to print what we need. All these things were there, rather than just saying, I just found a handful of good factories. There are many, many great factories in the UK. Obviously, there's a region in the Midlands, Leicestershire, that is kind of like, that's where there's a massive amount. And there's been so much negativity there that it's almost, that's it now, that's stuck.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, literally,
there's some great factories up there as well.
I tell you, honestly, you say, what do I want to do? In my career now, I still need to pay the bills, but I want to give back. I want to help the industry and brands to be better, more profitable, but also better from a social environmental point of view. If anyone said to me, well, tell me a good factory in the UK or in Leicestershire, just ring, call, email, whatever. I'll take you.
LinkedIn message.
Link me in. I'll take you. I'll tell you, because honestly, there's some great, and if we look after those and we grow them, they will become stronger. Yeah. And the ones that aren't so good will start to, we've got the cream will rise. At the moment, it seems that it's still this undercurrent and it's still bubbling. And there are no doubt certain brands that still behave in that way. Well, good luck, because your time will be short-lived.
Yeah, at some stage your consumers will call you out.
You will, and other bodies will be calling them out in that space as well. So, that's their business. But my business would be, look at it. If you don't understand it, let me help you. And equally, from a recon, if you want to talk about circularity and in that space about how to deal with either unwanted stock, dead stock that you've got, and how we can, some of it might not be relevant to recon, but I have a network of other people that could also help in that space. So it's about working that conglomerate, if you like. I don't see this space of ESG as a competitive space. Like I say, I want to pay me rent and so on. But ultimately, if I can find a solution that doesn't point it to me and it's passed on, and it might be then you think, oh, he's good, we can use you for something else. So
I think it feels like it's about collaboration and just pointing people in a better direction.
And a word I use called co-opetition.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people saying they're collaborating and they, you might need to work with your competition. We've seen it in other industries.
Well, the CMA have came out and said they're actively
looking at how they are going to ensure that they're not going to come after you in that space, because it shouldn't be competitive. in terms of finding the solutions. I mean, if you decide you're the only one that's going to do everything well and you want to work that and keep that to yourself and give yourself competitive advantage, then you've got that opportunity. But actually, you need scale, and you'll only get scale from doing it with others. And that's another issue around all of this, has been none of it seems to go into that cooperative space, and therefore doesn't quite get the scale, doesn't get the price, and then we just keep hitting this wall, which is a price, and it's so short-sighted, narrow-minded to think that that's it, that's as far as we'll go, when there's so much value.
More opportunity. I think I've got one last question on that, which is, what excites you for the future within fashion?
I think the biggest thing, it's a bit weird to say this, but actually there's a couple of things that excite me. I think we'll have a healthier fashion industry, because I think with what's going to happen around law and legislation, with what's going to happen around consumer behaviour with knowledge, I think it can only get better. And I think that technology supports that. I think there's more people aware within industry of how to do some of the stuff I'm talking about. And as I say, if they're not, give me a shout. I'll help you with that. And then we could have a really prosperous, and, this is, we need to also look at our biggest assets within the fashion industry. That's the people making our clothes, that work in these regions. We need to start looking at wages. How are we going to ever deal with that if we're not happy with the profits that we're making? And it's just, it's just like we're never going to deal with that. There's people trying, but it never gets anywhere. And I know that's an absolute massive topic around changing,
But at least people are talking about it
but
now.
It's now like, let's see a little bit more action in that space. Let's start to see some benefits for those, because without any of those people that make our clothes, there is no brands, there is no fashion. And, it's very short-sighted, narrow-minded. The very fact that we often call people that work in the workers, I hate that.
People that make your clothes.
It's, I don't know, it just doesn't sit comfortably with me. Maybe because I think of bees and things like that. Or they're the ones that, but they're the ones doing all the real hard work. They're talented. It's a skill. We had so much skill in the UK around manufacturing. We some of the people that working in industry in the UK back in the 80s and were the best paid by hour workers in that in industry. And like I say, I'm not saying we need to rebuild the past, but we need to rebuild a future that's fit for what the future of fashion looks like, and using all of its assets that will support a new world of manufacturing in the UK, because moving things all around the world, buying markdown, paying taxes for products that aren't sourced using certain materials, in not taking advantage of incentives that would help you produce in the UK, are all going to be commercially wrong. So what excites me is that we're moving in the right direction. I just want to see a little bit more action, a little less conversation, as Elvis said, and just see people and CFOs and CEOs being a bit braver in this space, because they realise this is about the long game and not the short game, while understanding that they currently have to run something which is fighting against something which is not at all fair.
Building more solid foundations for the future.
Yeah, really, doubling down on your foundations to ensure none of the businesses that are out there would be saying, look, well, let's just do what we're doing now because we've only got a couple of years left. No, none of them would be doing that. But the smart ones will be going, look, we've got to do what we've got to do, but let's start doing it smarter. Let's look at where we are inefficient. Where are we wasting? Where are we missing opportunities? Do we know our supply base? Step one is transparency and traceability. And again, if we're talking product passports and stuff, you're going to have that. So don't wait till New Year's Eve 2020, whatever, and then say, right, let's start looking at who we work with in Tier 3 and Tier 4. Get on that now. The smart ones will be getting ahead of the game and positioning themselves in the strongest place they can be to push on in the next 3, 4, 5 years. And what excites me is that that can happen if you choose to be smart now and not cheap. And not wait. Yeah.
Well, on that more positive note, Simon, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I've enjoyed listening to you, and I hope the people who listen to this episode have taken a few points away, because I think there's a lot in there for people to think about, and also hopefully just think about the way that we produce things as an overall, as opposed to just looking at it in isolation. So thank you so much for sharing your insight.
I hope people could understand. Sorry if you couldn't. That's just Yorkshire.
No, I think
thank
you're
you.
fine. Thank you very much.
Cheers.